Thank you very much, Faye. It's again a pleasure to be here with CCGI at another governance week, which has been going actually quite splendidly, from starting with Professor King's presentation on Sunday. And I've dropped into some of the sessions in between the football over the course of the last couple of days. One of the things that I suppose Faye might have neglected to mention is that we both worked together at Guardian Holdings many years ago, and so I consider her to be one of my colleagues from that particular era. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing my screen in terms of the presentation, if I can find it. Yeah. Right. And the topic is the governance in the public sector, and I've identified in the title the question of state-owned enterprises and statutory corporations. Let me start off by kind of talking through a little bit the question of the evolution of corporate governance and how state enterprises, stroke statutory corporations, have evolved into the whole discourse on corporate governance. Because corporate governance as an issue, as a topic, actually began in the private sector. It began with a set of corporate failures, if you remember, back in the 1980s beginning. I would think with BCCI, we had the Robert Maxwell issue in 1991. And so when we start talking about corporate governance and the history, we usually date it back to the Cadbury Committee, and the focus of the Cadbury Committee and some of the subsequent work that was done by the King Report, Mervyn King's Report #1 and King Report #2. There's a lot of focus on the role of the auditors, because there was a sense then that a big part of the problem for the collapse of some of these institutions had to do with the fact that the auditing was inadequate. We saw the same thing actually in the case of Enron, where the auditors, who were Arthur Anderson at the time, I think, were actually found to be quite complicit in the eventual failure of Enron. But the focus on state enterprises, I think, really dates back to the early 2000s. And at least I'm dating it back to when we could identify the OECD guidelines being put out in 2005, which explicitly focused on the question of governance of state-owned enterprises. That OECD governance guidelines were revised in 2016 or 2015, they were revised. We've seen the sets of issues dealt with in terms of corporate governance evolve over the course of the last 20 or 25 years or so. The role of focus on the role of the chairman, the importance of the role of board committees, the question of board leadership. And within the last, I would say 5 or 6 years, there has been a discussion around board culture, around values, and then most recently, including, of course, featuring very prominently at this CCGI Governance Week, there is a new discussion emerging around ESG. So we've seen that evolution, and the question is that, of course, that state enterprises are now part of that conversation, beginning. I'm dating it around the early 2000s. Now, of course, if you look at the top of the chart, you see that the companies that have identified that have well, I'm saying signally failed, which is BCCI and Enron, WorldCom, and coming up to Carillion, most recently in 2018, that I haven't identified any state entities there. And I suppose if I were to try to do that, it would simply fill up the page, because there have been very many state enterprises or statutory corporations that have in fact failed. But when state enterprises fail, their funerals are rather more quiet than when private sector organizations fail. When private sector organizations fail, there's a big splash, there's a lot of news, headlines in the newspapers. when state enterprises fail, governments very quietly just go about and bury them. So we can trace, coming to the Caribbean, we see that, for example, in Jamaica had instituted public bodies accountability legislation as early as 2001. So there was a recognition in Jamaica as early as 2001 about the need for accountability for public bodies. I should point out that in the case of Jamaica, Jamaica has a large number of what they call public bodies. Most of them are, in fact, statutory corporations. In other words, they are creatures of statute. Unlike Trinidad and Tobago, where we do have some statutory corporations, but most of the enterprises that we're talking about are, in fact, state enterprises. That is to say, they are incorporated under the company's law, and there is no legislation governing the operation of those entities. And that, in fact, was a preferred mechanism in Trinidad for creating and operationalizing these entities. And we'll talk a little bit later as to why that was so in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. But Jamaica was off the blocks very early in terms of dealing with this issue. There was the PSOJ Corporate Governance Code in 2006, which applied. This is the private sector code in Jamaica. And then more recently, we've seen it's a sort of a white paper on the categorization and rationalization of public bodies in 2016. Trinidad has no legislation governing state-owned enterprises per se. And again, that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But it has had cause to address the question of state enterprises periodically over the course of the last 35 years or so. There was the Bob Committee in 1985. I was a member of that committee. At the time I was in the central bank. Uric Bob was then the governor of the bank. The Rampersad, the very famous Frank Rampersad Committee of 1990, which I think has produced the most comprehensive report and set of recommendations on state enterprises in Trinidad, and which led to the creation of the Divestment Secretariat within the Ministry of Finance, which then proceeded to, in the course of the 1990s, to divest a large number of state enterprises that had, in fact, outlived their usefulness, let me put it that way, and that were a significant drain on the Treasury. We had the State Enterprise Performance Monitoring Manual in 2011, and then the committee that I chaired back in 2016, which looked at the wholly owned state enterprises. The multilaterals have also focused on the question of corporate governance at state enterprises. The World Bank, as early as 2006, a publication called Held by the Visible Hand. Visible, therefore, meaning the government is controlling it, as distinct from the invisible hand, which is the market controlling it. And they produced a corporate governance for SOE's toolkit in 2014. And the IDB, which covers the Americas, has also recently addressed the issue in a publication entitled Fixing State-Owned Enterprises, as recently as 2019. The quote I have there from the World Bank, I think, is important. It says, and you can read, of course, it says that past efforts at reform have made clear that poor SOE performance, where it occurs, is caused less by exogenous or sector-specific problems than by fundamental problems in their governance. That is, the underlying rules, processes, and institutions that govern the relationship between SOE managers and their government owners. And I think this is going to be the heart of what we are going to be talking about. What is the difference or the distinction between corporate governance in the private and corporate governance in the public sector? Is there a difference? And if there is a difference, what is the nature and content of that? So to approach the topic, what I did is that I essentially looked at the OECD guidelines, have identified 6 through 10 are really the sort of normal things that we talk about in relation to corporate governance, even in the context of the private sector. So, you know, the number 6 talks about the role of the chairman. Number 7 talks about if there are employee representation. Number 8 talks about setting up specialized committees of independent and qualified directors. The 9 talks about performance evaluation of the board, and 10 talks about internal audit. All those things are things that we know and understand very clearly in the context of corporate governance within the private sector. So it is really the first 5 that I wanted to focus on. And it's very interesting that the OECD actually put these 5 at the top, because I think in examining these 5, we will begin to see very clearly where the challenges to corporate governance lie in respect of state enterprises and statutory corporations. So let's start with the first. And I've identified the key words there, which is really the question of mandate, the question of ultimate responsibility for the enterprise's performance, the question of being defined in legislation according to company law, and accountability to the owners. So let's start with the first 2, the question of mandate. It's very interesting that a state enterprise really should be established for a particular reason. It shouldn't come into existence sort of willy-nilly, right? And that reason for its establishment or for its creation. And I suppose I should best back up a little bit and explain, wearing my economist hat, why that is the case. In other words, why would you create a state enterprise? And the reason is that the government has several different ways in which they can intervene in the economy. And obviously, one of the ways, or the preferred way, if you asked, I suppose, most economists, what is the preferred way in which the government can or should intervene in an economy, the answer would be through regulation. In other words, if you already have a market that is operating, there are actors in that market, so it might be the banking industry or the insurance industry, there are players in that market, but there are public policy concerns. Obviously, in the case of banking, you want to make sure that depositors are protected. In the case of insurance, that policyholders are protected. In the case of the capital markets, that investors are protected. So there's a public policy concern that governments have. And how should governments deal with that? Well, the best way to deal with it typically is through regulation. You set up regulations and you tell those market actors how they should behave. And if they don't behave in that particular kind of way, then there are certain kinds of sanctions. So you have central banks and you have financial sector commissions and so on, which regulate particular markets. Now, there are certain circumstances where it is not possible to, in fact, regulate the market. For example, you may have a utility. It might be water, or it might be electricity, or it might be an airport. Something what economists call natural monopolies. Where you have a natural monopoly, it makes sense for the state to own the thing and for the state to run it. For example, in the United States, for example, even those utilities, water, electricity, and so on, are in fact provided by the private sector, because in an economy like the United States, which is very, very large, they have multiple market actors operating in that space. So the government there goes for regulation. In small economies like ours, where these utilities are natural monopolies, it makes sense for the government to own the entity. And then there may be other reasons. For example, if you, an airline, for example, if you're talking about CAL or LIAT or any one of them, where for certain strategic reasons, or let us say in the case of Trinidad, the petroleum industry or the natural gas industry, you may decide for strategic reasons in terms of disciplining the market that it makes sense to set up a state enterprise in order to achieve that particular public policy objective, because regulation is not going to work. So the point I'm making is that when you set up a state enterprise, it should be established for a particular reason. There must be a mandate. And it is very, very clear, for example, in the case of New Zealand, in New Zealand, they have recognized the importance of setting out that mandate very clearly. And in fact, what they do in New Zealand is that they set out the mandate in legislation, which we'll talk about in a second. But of course, over time, the economy or the market could change and the original rationale or reasons for setting up that enterprise could become irrelevant or questionable. But the enterprise may continue to function. And we have many instances of that, I think, certainly in Trinidad, and I suspect elsewhere in the Caribbean, where what you have is what I call benign neglect, where the enterprise continues to function. It goes off doing its own merry way, and it's essentially flying below the radar, because what happens with governments and what happens with the public sector is that if that enterprise is not drawing on the treasury, in other words, it is not a concern to the Minister of Finance because it's not making losses and he doesn't have to fund those losses, it can fly below the radar and it can go off and do all kinds of things. Right? So the second problem is that the mandate given to a state enterprise might be opaque, right? And there may be no mandate at all, depending on how that state enterprise came into existence. And again, there are examples of that we have in the Trinidad and Tobago context, of which I'm more familiar, where state enterprises have been created on a Monday morning and then shut down on a Wednesday morning, because they literally, I mean, not quite as dramatic as that, but certainly within a year, the enterprise never becomes operational because the government realizes we don't need to have that entity functioning. And the other problem with mandates, as I point out here, is that the resources provided by the government, in other words, the rationale or the mandate may be perfectly fine, but that the government is unable fiscally to support that mandate. It can't provide the resources to the entity in order to be able to carry out or to discharge that mandate. And that puts the board of directors of that entity in something of a challenging position. The other point about ultimate responsibility, the OECD guidelines say that the board of directors must have the ultimate responsibility, but of course we know that that is not in fact so. The ultimate responsibility typically rests with the government. It typically rests with the minister. Performance monitoring and evaluation is often weak in the public sector. The losses incurred by these enterprises may become chronic, and they don't become a concern, as I've mentioned before, until such time as there are, as we're having in Trinidad, the rest of the Caribbean now, where revenues are down, then you start to get concerned about the losses that these enterprises are making. On the questions of the legislative basis and being grounded in company law, again, here both, very interesting examples in the case of both New Zealand and in the case of Norway. So as I mentioned before, Trinidad and Tobago, we have had state enterprises here. Actually, the first enterprise created in Trinidad was in 1957. I think it was Palo Seco Agricultural Enterprises Limited was created back in 1957. Since the 1980s, we've created a lot of them, particularly when revenues are rising, the government finds it convenient to create these enterprises. And why do they create them? They create them essentially because the government wanted to get around the Central Tenders Board Ordinance, Central Tender Board Act, so that these enterprises could go and they could engage in procurement without having to go through the Central Tenders Board. So they were set up as companies under the Companies Act. But that creates its own tensions, if you like, culminating, as some of you in Trinidad may remember, in the UDICOT situation, where when UDICOT was created in the 1990s, I think it was 1995 or 1996, the government had a clear option as to whether it should be created as a statutory corporation or created as a state enterprise incorporated under the Companies Act. It chose the latter. And of course, we know what happened to UDICOT during the course of the early 2000s. So that when you had the UDICOT Commission of Inquiry, the Commission of Inquiry into the construction sector, the UF Commission of Inquiry, one of the things that came out of that inquiry was that UDICOT said, we don't have to listen to the minister. The board of the UDICOT, we are under the Companies Act, we're responsible, and we don't have to listen to the minister, which is a rather strange concept for an organization which is created by the state and funded by the state. And you know, I go back to Mervyn King's presentation to us on Sunday, and the rather interesting notion I find, which is to say that companies do not have owners. I would I would challenge somebody to go and tell some government somewhere that they don't own these enterprises that they've created, because the truth of the matter is that they do have owners, and the government believes that it owns these enterprises and that it can direct these enterprises as they should. I will come to that a little bit later on, as they should. But the point I'm making is that in New Zealand and Norway, what they do, and which is what essentially the committee which I chaired back in 2016 essentially recommended, is that you have a sort of a two-tiered structure. You form the company under the Companies Act so that it operates like a private entity in terms of corporate governance. But in addition to that, you have a State Enterprises Act. And so therefore what you do then is that you deem the enterprise to be a state enterprise and you bring it under the provisions of the State Enterprise Act. That does a couple of things. One is that when it ceases to be a state enterprise, it can simply fall back into being a company under the Companies Act because it could be privatized and it just simply goes its way. But when it's under the State Enterprise Act, in the case of, for example, of New Zealand, it's very clear about the mandate that it must have. It's very clear about its accountabilities, how it should account to Parliament, for example. It's very clear, as in the case of Norway, what are the inputs that the government or the minister can make to that enterprise and in what areas. So you try to get the best of both possible worlds. One is that you try to get the best of corporate governance in a private sector kind of context, but there's also a recognition that the state, that the government, that the citizens who ultimately own this enterprise also need to make certain critical inputs into the operation and to the management of this particular entity. I think that covers both sets of points here, the question of how you ground, or the legislative basis for grounding the enterprise, and the question of the accountability to owners. I just mentioned here, by the way, the question of New Zealand's no surprises policy. And those of you in Trinidad would have been very familiar with in recent times about what happened with WASA and the disconnection drive and so on, where WASA instituted a disconnection drive in the middle of a pandemic without the knowledge of its line minister. That kind of thing is covered by the New Zealand no surprises policy. In other words, it says to the enterprise, listen, if you are going to do something, to the board, if you are going to do something which as we say, can attract public interest, whether positive or negative, you need to give the minister advance notice. And I think that that's fair and reasonable. There should be no surprises for the government, positive or negative, and I suppose especially if it's negative, in the operation of a state enterprise. Let me go on then to the question of strategy. The only point I would want to make here quite simply is that the mandate of the enterprise is usually fixed and it's supposed to be clear. So therefore, it gives very little room, in my view, for the enterprise to go making strategy. Why? Because strategy essentially involves creating change. Strategy involves creating change, responding to something in the marketplace or creating a new market and making change. And that may bring the enterprise into tension with its mandate. So the point is that while we say, yes, boards have a responsibility for strategy, in the context of state enterprises and statutory corporations, that is very, very narrow. Once you have the mandate that a clear mandate by the government, then the scope for strategy making on the part of the board is considerably narrowed. The OECD guidelines talk about the power to appoint and remove the CEOs. In practice, I'm saying that does not happen. As far as I'm aware, anyway, certainly in that context, that the appointment of the CEO is either made by the political directorate or it is approved by the political directorate. So there may be a procedure, certainly in the case of statutory corporations, it is written into legislation that says that if you are going to appoint the CEO, that appointment must be approved by the relevant minister. Setting of executive remuneration levels. Again, here too, I'm saying that the scope within state enterprise and statutory corporations is extremely narrow, to the point, quite frankly, of being non-existent in some instances. I can speak about the Trinidad context in respect of directors' remuneration, certainly. The Trinidad has what, A and B and C and D enterprises, and that tells you what the compensation of the directors will be. That compensation is extremely low, I could say. It is extremely low. It is unrelated to the market situation that directors face. And it is also, it's such that it leads to, I think, some uncomfortable situations for directors who are taking on significant responsibility, but yet their compensation for that, as prescribed by the government, is extremely paltry. And that is justified by the government by saying, well, yes, you're doing public service, et cetera, which is fine. But the point is, my point is that the responsibility that directors face, including conforming with things like the Integrity in Public Life Act, et cetera, are things which I think need to be better compensated. And as far as executive compensation is concerned, that too, I know from, certainly from my own experience, that government ministers are very jealous about what levels of compensation are paid within the state enterprise sector, right? And that if you, just to give a little story, when I was a chairman of a state enterprise, this is many years ago, the CEO of the company was given permission by myself as the chairman to buy a Mercedes-Benz. And I got a call from the minister as to how it is, you know, this CEO could be driving a Benz. I don't drive a Benz. But the point was, and I made the point to him, is that the policy simply said that the car that the CEO should have should not exceed a certain value, and that the Mercedes-Benz was within that value. But those are the kinds of things that can happen in respect of this question about managing remuneration and compensation in state enterprises. Let's go on to more interesting and challenging issues. The question in the OECD guidelines, it talks about the exercise of objective judgment on the part of directors. The problem here, and that directors should be nominated based on their qualifications. The problem here is that directors of these entities tend to be political appointments. In both senses of that word, political. And very often we find situations where directors are appointed because of their political connections, not because they have the necessary kinds of competencies and so on required to run the board and to run the enterprise effectively. But what is also more interesting is that directors see themselves as being political appointees. So we have the situation in the Trinidad and Tobago context, and I don't know whether it applies to the same extent in other countries. As I said, Jamaica has far fewer of these enterprises than when we do, that when there is a change of government, there's an election, government changes, all these directors resign because they see themselves as being political appointees. And that is, I think, from the point of view of continuity, from the point of view of institutional memory, and all of those things is not something that is, I think, a good thing for these state enterprises. And I believe Camille Facey talked about it at a previous webinar in the context of Jamaica, that they had now instituted a new system whereby not all of the directors resign when there's a change of government to ensure that there is that continuity. Let me go on then onto to this question of conflict of interest that as the OECD guidelines say, that directors should avoid conflicts of interest that prevent the board from objectively doing their duties. A conflict of interest arises where a director makes or participates in making a decision knowing that there is an opportunity to further their private interests. And we know that this is one of the big problems that you have with state enterprises and territorial corporations. They are notorious for all kinds of corruption, from petty corruption to grand corruption, from directors of the airline getting first class tickets free, directors getting tickets to FETs, diverting materials to their private projects, using the personnel in the state enterprise to carry out their own private work, influencing the award of contracts to their firms and so on and so forth. And this notoriety, I think, has become, yes, it has become almost endemic, right? And it articulates in what I said before, that the appointees to these boards are very often politically connected people who are not necessarily put there for their competence. But the point being that the corruption that we have at state-owned entities, I think, is even more egregious because it involves public monies and directors, just like in the private sector. Directors are in a position of trust in respect of the monies that they are responsible for. And the key difference, let me come to the question of political interference. What Martin Daly has called interfering intravenously, a rather felicitous phrase that Martin developed. And the OECD guidelines talk about limiting political interference. Now, they don't talk about eliminating political interference, because I think there's a recognition that that is almost impossible. But they talk about limiting it. Limiting it because the truth of the matter is that the government, the ministers, the politicians of the day do have a right to make inputs into the operation, into what the enterprise is doing. They do have that right. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But what happens very often with these entities is that the ministers, the government tends to interfere. They can compromise the mandate of the state enterprise. They may change it, you know, from what it's supposed to be, which is one of the reasons why, in the case of New Zealand, for example, the mandate is legislated. It is put into Parliament, so it's very clear what you are supposed to be doing. So any deviation from that attention can be drawn to any deviation from that. That they should not impose partisan political considerations on operational decisions. Meaning what? Meaning, like, if you are operating an airline, that a government of the day doesn't come in and say to the airline, we want you to start flying to London, with all of that, the implications of that, because it's whimsically, somebody decides that the airline should be flying to London. And you then do that, and the airline proceeds to rack up the losses, which were quite predictable, causing the board to breach principles of good corporate governance, or causing the board or the management to act unlawfully. Right? So those are some of the concerns that we have, and I want to focus a little bit more on the question of what I'm describing as unlawful or inappropriate directives. And these can come in a number of different ways. And I think that very often, it is not very often the case. It is going to be very rarely the case that you are going to have a government minister who is going to put into writing what he wants that entity to do. It's going to be a phone call. It's going to be a WhatsApp, well, hopefully not even a WhatsApp message, because those can be distributed. It's going to be a phone call. It's going to be a suggestion. And it's about how the chairman and how the board responds to that suggestion from the minister, which may be, as I said, unlawful or inappropriate. The question of compliance with the Integrity in Public Life Act I talked about. the reputational damage to directors in the context of litigation against the enterprise or corporate failure, and litigation in respect of the performance of your fiduciary duty. We've seen that in the case of ETEC, Petrotrin, and UTT. So Trinidad has generated some very interesting cases recently, most notably, I think, the ETEC case, which went to the Court of Appeal on this question of the duties and responsibilities of directors. And importantly, in those cases, whether the directors can claim that the minister told them to do X or Y or Z. And the court was very clear in the case of the ETEC matter that the directors can make no such claim. They can make no such argument that the director, that the minister told them to do X or Y or Z. If you are a company under the Companies Act, then essentially from the court's point of view, the buck stops with you, and that you can't have resort to what the minister may or may not have said or may or may not have directed. So how do you, as a director of a state enterprise or statutory corporation, respond to unlawful or inappropriate directives? You can ignore them. You probably will not find yourself on that board for very long after that, but you could do that. You could find a reason not to comply. You could ask that the request be put in writing, which usually could put a stop to it. You can negotiate with the minister concerned, and you can steer the request to some kind of alternative, non-compromising option, which if you are a sufficiently skillful chairman, sufficiently politically savvy, then that is something which I think you might want to consider doing. You can simply refuse, or you can resign. So those essentially are the options that you have in front of you. And these things, by the way, I'm not making up these are not hypotheticals. These things can and do happen, and they have happened. If you are director of a tourism development company, and months before the general election, your board is asked to spend money to pave roads, then what do? It's an inappropriate request. It has absolutely nothing to do with your mandate as a tourism development company. Well, it's stretching it a bit to say that you are engaged in road paving. What then do you do, right? And so I'm suggesting that perhaps the best option, if you can and you have those skills, is to find some alternative that is more palatable. So what then, if we can summarize and try and pull all of this together, what explains failures in governance at SOEs? We pointed out initially with the World Bank statement on this, that the failures that we see for SOEs are due to failures of governance. And what gives rise to that? I'm suggesting that there are essentially 6 things. 1, political culture of the place. I've adverted previously to places like Norway and places like New Zealand. And obviously the political culture in those countries is very different from the political culture in the Caribbean, in the West Indies. The lack of clarity of mandate, very important. No market discipline, so that the enterprise essentially does what it wants, and it racks up losses, it imposes costs. Weak regulatory discipline, except I'm saying for banks and financial institutions, state-owned banks and financial institutions. There is no threat of bankruptcy, so that where a private entity would go bankrupt, would become insolvent and would have to go out of business, state enterprises can just simply continue because they continue to be supported by taxpayers' money. And the selection and appointment of directors, the criteria, the expertise, the training, and so on of these directors. Those are the things that explain the failure of state enterprises. And so the effect of those is that you have poor routine, what I call routine governance practices, which I think are unlikely to lead to failure. But we have seen that, certainly the committee that I looked at, you see that kind of thing in certain enterprises where you don't have audited accounts for years, right? Where companies don't hold meetings as they should. meetings are not properly recorded, decisions are not properly. These are basic, very basic things to corporate governance, and we find that many state enterprises fail to follow through in doing those things. Poor performance management and monitoring, that's really the responsibility of the government to ensure that these enterprises are properly monitored and managed. And again, we found that that function within the Ministry of Finance Investment Division in Trinidad and Tobago was weak for a variety of reasons. Directors from outside the company, what I call interfering, intervening, not I call Martin Daly called interfering intravenously. Moral hazard, this is a critically important one, where because the enterprise is not subject to the discipline of the market and has no fear of bankruptcy, it creates a problem of moral hazard. They take excessive risks or they ignore cost overruns. And again, we've seen many examples of that, certainly in the Trinidad and Tobago context, where you had enterprises with lots of money flowing through them. And as a result of that, they engaged in projects. I mean, everybody understands the Petrotrin story. And if you look back at that story, that's exactly what you see in the Petrotrin situation. A company, significant amount of revenues coming through the top line because it's engaged in the oil sector, engaging in projects which were beyond its capabilities, beyond its project management capabilities, and as a result of that, creating a situation which eventually, of course, led to the closure of Petrotrin. We have truncated or uncertain terms for the appointment of directors. One of the problems that I've seen with statutory corporations and state enterprises is that directors are appointed for 2 years or for 3 years. Makes absolutely no sense, because a director knows that in that period of time, they can make no difference really to the operation of the business. And so therefore they may just simply coast for the 2 years. They really don't do much. And so that is something that the government needs to look at, that is to say the tenure of directors. And importantly, the inability to discipline or control politically connected managers. So how do we go about then improving governance at state enterprises? Well, there are 3 things I want to suggest. And basically, I'm drawing on what I've seen in terms of the models in places like New Zealand, which is a very small society like ours. New Zealand has a population of 5 million people. It's very market oriented in terms of how it operates. It does have state enterprises, including airlines, a number of enterprises in mining, which are owned by the state. But what it has done is that it has clarified how these entities are supposed to operate by a piece of legislation that covers all of these entities. And in particular, they have addressed the question of the clarification of the mandate. But first of all, there's a question of clarifying the intervention rights. In other words, understanding, because the state has the authority, and I would say the right to intervene, the question is, when should it do so? Under what circumstances and for what purpose? And if we look at the New Zealand example, there are essentially 4 areas in which government intervention is I don't want to say restricted. Yes, let's say restricted. It's restricted to these areas. 1, what's your strategic plan? All right. In other words, if you are an airline and the government says this is what your mandate is, then you create a strategic plan that conforms to that mandate. So the government has a right to intervene in respect of your strategic plan. 2, your dividend levels, because I need to get back a return from your operations that goes back to the citizens of the country. So I need to have influence in terms of what dividends you pay. 3, board appointments. I must be able to determine, or at the very least, to be able to reject certain nominations for appointments to the board. And 4thly, taking necessary remedial steps with state enterprises that fail to meet agreed performance targets. So the point is, you have a plan, you have a mandate, it is clear you have performance targets. When the entity fails to meet those performance targets, then the government has a right to intervene and to take appropriate action. I don't think anybody can have any quarrel with that. The second is consultation, cooperation, and coordination. Consulting with the government or with your ministers on key strategic or other matters, especially, for example, the issuance of shares. It might be the question of borrowing. For example, we've seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where entities, including state entities, airlines and so on, have had to have resort to the Treasury in order to keep themselves afloat during this period of time. And so they have to go to issue either new share issuance or debt or convertible debt. And in those circumstances, the state as the owner will then, you have to consult, you have to cooperate with the state in terms of getting those kinds of things done, right? Benchmarking with the private sector, adopting private sector compensation policies and practices, and limiting non-commercial objectives. What do I mean by, let's talk about CSR. We had the very famous case in Trinidad of the National Gas Company during a certain period of time engaging in all kinds of activities under the banner of CSR that had absolutely nothing to do with its mandate and ended up contributing to the dissipation of its capital and of its reserves, including engaging in a project, the Beetham wastewater project, which lost it a lot of money. And the third suggestion is, in terms of improving governance, is bringing the entities into under the Companies Act on the New Zealand or the Norwegian model, which is to say that, as I said before, that they're incorporated under the Companies Act, but you layer on top of that, you layer a state enterprise act, you deem them to be a state enterprise, and within that act, there are specific kinds of things that they are required to do and specific accountabilities that they must have and they must conform to. So it's in addition to whatever obtains in the private sector under the Companies Act, this device, this mechanism would take into account the fact that it is taxpayers' money, it is public money, and put these additional responsibilities onto the directors to ensure that the enterprise operates in a particular kind of way. So I think that those approaches, which some of which were reflected in the recommendations which the committee which I chaired in 2016 actually made to the government of the day, that this is the direction in which we should go. So at the end of the day, I'm saying in respect of directors or directorships of state-owned enterprises, you may view them as being high status. You may view yourself being appointed to a state enterprise board as being influential with the political directorate, which you probably are. You may view it as an opportunity to do public service, which it certainly is. But a directorship of a state-owned enterprise is also risky, both financially and reputationally. It is onerous in terms of compliance with the Integrity Commission in Trinidad, described, and the word onerous there comes directly from a Court of Appeal judgment, which is the TSTT case, which describes the provisions of the Integrity in Public Life Act as onerous. They are onerous on the directors, and directors need to understand and appreciate that. And unfortunately, your tenure as a director of a state-owned enterprise might be short. So with that, I hope I haven't gone over my time. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope we can have an interesting and useful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farrell. That was really such an absolutely comprehensive, well-researched, brilliant presentation, which I hope every director of state enterprises will present to hear this morning. You have certainly given us a lot to think about, but I think more than anything for me, the overriding thought that comes is the fact that it is governance to a great extent which must be addressed and which can and help bring about the kinds of changes we want, because state enterprises directly impact quality of lives, and we ought to really do what we can to see how we can address a lot of these concerns which you have articulated for us today. Some of these solutions you have presented certainly are very interesting, and I would like to hear from our participants in the audience today what may be some of their responses to what you have shared. In the chat so far, we have had from Laura Control Thomas a very provocative question. What can the CCGI do to advocate for full proclamation of the procurement legislation? And of course, inherent in that is the fact that there's a reason for why government is not proclaiming the full regulation, a lot of which may be tied to many of the concerns which Dr. Farrell has raised here today. So how can we treat with many of these challenges which Dr. Farrell has raised here today? So I'm opening the floor to discussions now. Let's see if anyone would like to ask Dr. Farrell a question or provide a comment or suggestion. And if, as we wait for persons, Dr. Farrell, I think one of the major hurdles we need to overcome is this issue of director selection and appointment in state enterprises. And you pointed to a lot of the issues that need to be addressed there. The political appointment is a question that has been addressed during Governance Week already. And as some persons have pointed out, not all political appointees may be incompetent. There are some persons who may be politically aligned but bring a level of competence, but they may be constrained by a lot of what you have shared in terms of the interference from the minister's line or from the political directorate. And the other thing that you pointed to, and which I think is something we really need to address, is this whole issue of the Integrity in Public Life Act. If we want persons of a certain caliber and experience to enter the boardroom in state enterprises, then we need to find ways to encourage them to be there. And I think there have been a number of persons who have made it very clear that they think that really having to comply with that legislation means they're just not going to put themselves up for service. So we have two questions now, along with some of the points that I've just raised. They're both from Aline Makomi. She asks, how do we work to influence the politics towards good governance? That's one question we all need to ponder on. And the other, and I'm going to direct that to our chairman. How can the CCGI, as an NGO, a non-partisan body, what can we do to influence that change? So Dr. Farrell, I'll ask you to respond to the first question from Aline. How can we work to influence politics towards good governance? And then I'll ask Nigel to respond to the second question.
I don't know if Aline wants to answer her own question. I mean, Aline worked with politicians for her entire career. And I don't know what success that you have in terms of influencing the politics. Because I didn't make the point about political culture, right? And that is the thing. It's so if you look at and what we did very deliberately is to look at small countries like Norway, like New Zealand, like Singapore, just like us, small countries. And then you look at what they have done, and you look at how their enterprises have performed, and you realize that number one, there is no, it is not necessarily the case that the state enterprises are failures. Not at all. Singapore Airlines is the best airline in the world, and it's a state-owned enterprise. So it is not about it is not about being a state-owned enterprise. It's about having a political culture in which the state is clear about the mandate, chooses that route, puts the right people in charge to deal with it. So if I have an airline, for example, I put people on the board who know something about airlines, okay? Doesn't matter what political party they're affiliated with, who they vote for, I put the best people that I can find on that. I'm clear about their mandate and I let them run. And I'm hands off, except, as I said, for those 4 areas, right, where if it's failing, you got to intervene. I need to tell me about your dividends. Let me see your strategic plan if it's consistent with the mandate. And by the way, I need to report to Parliament periodically on what you're doing and how you're performing, and I will do that. But other than that, you let them get on with it. But our political culture, unfortunately, has not been that way. So the question is really, how do you change a political culture? And it comes back to Lloyd Best's question, you know, how does a culture escape from itself? And perhaps what we've seen historically in Trinidad, it is that when our backs are against the wall, as between 1986 and 1991, into an IMF program, lack of resources, the government says, hold on, we've got to change this. You have the Rampersad committee and you begin to change it. You have a divestment secretariat, it gets rid of a whole bunch of them. Prices go up, revenues start coming back in, and what happens? You just start creating these enterprises all over again. So so in short answer, Arlene, I don't know how you influence the politicians to do that. But yes, it's something that is absolutely necessary. It has to happen.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. Nigel, just before I go to you, we do have someone who we cannot identify in the room, and I'm happy that that person has now put a question in the chat so we can ask you, please. The person who is identified as user, we need to know who you are. So either you rename yourself or you can type who you are in the chat here and we would be able to rename you in the room, just so that everyone is also aware who is asking the questions. So Nigel, let's go to the second question, which we are directing to you from Ali Makumi.
So for me, the critical thing is purpose. If you're looking at a state enterprises, one has to be very clear as to why that, well, what's the purpose, as Terry puts it, the mandate for the state enterprise. What is it designed to achieve? And then the board and with the management has to focus on ensuring that whatever actions they take is consistent with delivering that purpose. And for me, that's the essence. And how CCGI can influence that is through education and forums like these, so that people understand that if they want to achieve, if they really want to achieve the stated purpose, this is how you do it. I was the chairman of one board, which was technically not a state enterprise. And as soon as I realized that the purpose was no longer feasible, I resigned. And that's the option one has to take, because if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. And then one should not continue to perpetuate something that doesn't make sense. And for me, the purpose is they have to start with purpose.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nigel. Now, Lara's next comment on the chat actually leads to a very deep question as well. She says, so even if you don't comply with the procurement legislation and your name, no, that's the Integrity in Public Life Act, forgive me. And so your name is published in the newspaper, there's no real consequence. So what she's pointed to and what really is an issue for us in this country is both transparency, but especially accountability. How do we ensure that as individuals, we build that culture and behavior of accountability? And is consequences, does it make a difference? So Dr. Farrell, in fact, during the Corporate Secretaries Forum on Monday, we had a few corporate secretaries who said that they have seen changes in the boardroom in state enterprises where they are asking ministers to put in writing any directives that they feel is not in compliance with what they ought to be doing. And what they said is they have seen government ministers respond and put that in writing. So it's interesting to see how that is developing. So maybe, and the only reason it's happened, it's because of the Privy Council decision. It is because it has been stated quite clearly that directors will be held liable. Yeah, so that issue of accountability, we probably need to help build for persons to recognize the consequence in order that we begin to see that being addressed. So a question, I'm still not seeing who our user is, so please, I'm going to ask you to put your name in the chat, but your question is based on your response, and I'm imagining this is the response from Dr. Farrell. The question of executing government mandate comes into play. So how would you address this? Let me just see, there was a comment above that, so maybe it is related. Okay, so I'm just seeing that question. So what I'm thinking is he's saying, and the example you gave with the airline is an excellent one. You know, if the state enterprise is set up and the mandate is clear, you put a competent board in place and then allow them to be able to make the decisions to run because the mandate is clear. So the question of executing the mandate comes into play. I imagine it's referring to the fact that there still continues to be either government interference or what truly is the mandate.
Well, there shouldn't be an issue. Once the mandate is clear, there shouldn't be an issue around that. The other issues I raised is that the mandate might be clear, but the government does not resource the board adequately to execute on that mandate. And that puts the board in a very, very difficult position. What recommended was that you fly one type of aircraft, that you fly certain routes. So we said you fly to Toronto, you do the Caribbean milk run, Port of Spain, Barbados, Jamaica, you do Toronto, New York, Miami. That's it, right? One type of aircraft. And that's what CAL essentially from 2006 to 2011 precisely did. And the airline, it of course reduced its staff, it got rid of the pilot's black book, it rationalized a lot of things and so on, costs. And CAL began to turn the corner. I'm saying separate that from the airbridge issue because the airbridge to Tobago is always to be subsidized. And CAL began to turn the corner. The People's Partnership or UNC government comes in 2010 and says, fly to London. New type of aircraft, we don't have ETOPS, add a lot of costs, you end up, all right? And I'm not blaming the UNC here because prior to that, a PNM government minister had asked BWI to fly to Cuba, and they started to fly to Cuba. So it's not a question of PNM and UNC here. I'm just saying it's a situation where the politicians whimsically, I would have to say to the board, I want you to do X or I want you to do Y. The board will have to come back and say, that does not make sense, And we are not about to do that.
Yes, that does sound like a really good solution, but of course it requires a board of caliber to be able to stand, you know, and face your minister and say, no, we are not going to comply, but what would help, I'm sure, is here are the reasons why, you know. So Margaret Andy Pisa has a very interesting comment in the chat. She agrees with a lot of what has been said, and she asks, why can we not, I imagine, create a database where qualified persons who want to serve can submit their bios and are interviewed. And she continues with, I guess, a change of culture and transparency of election is what would be required to enable that. But it certainly is a good suggestion being put forward. Dr. Farrell, I think, you know, as you point to the two major political parties and the fact that persons always attempt to pigeonhole their responses on the basis of their political preference or affiliation. There really is need in this country for us to be able to find some sort of forum that allows us to bring everyone together who are competent and who are passionate about bringing change in this country, to do so outside of political allegiance. And I am looking forward to persons like yourself and other persons who we look at as leaders in this country, you know, to provide some guidance and direction for us, because we have a young generation coming up who are dynamic, who have a much bigger worldview, and oftentimes, I'm telling you, they are looking at us with utter disdain.
Well, I mean, on the question of the database, I'm just looking at recommendation 8 of our report, which reads, the investments division should develop and maintain a database of independent persons with qualifications and experience at home or abroad suitable for appointment to the boards of state enterprises. Because we recognized that you need to do that. And I would add now, based on a lot of things that we've talked about in this forum and elsewhere, that as part of that process, the training and which we'll talk about this afternoon, the training and the induction of potential directors, right? So even before somebody is put onto a board, you just simply offer them the training. It could be absolutely free through the CCGI. You just offer them training so that when they are eventually appointed, if they are appointed to a state board, they understand something about corporate governance. For example, we want to have young people come on to our boards as part of their development, et cetera, but they are innocent about matters relating to corporate governance. So one of the things that you can do with these younger people, and I say younger, I mean people in their 40s and 50s and so on, what you can do with them is that you can offer them that training so that they are prepared. So they get onto a state enterprise board or they get onto a private board, they understand something about how boards operate, they understand what the duties of directors are, and particularly in the context of state enterprises, they understand the nuances that are important in functioning as a director of a state enterprise or salutary corporation.
May I interject? Good morning, everyone. Just a couple of quick comments, if I may. The first is a big challenge with getting non-political persons to offer themselves to serve on state boards is the IPLA filing. I have a number of colleagues who I've reached out to, particularly trying to get more women on boards, diverse professionals and so on, and they just simply will not share their personal banking information about, you know, homes that they may own in other countries, because that's their business. That's not state money, it's not public funds. So I do think that IPLA is a huge barrier to getting non-political appointments onto state boards, and that's something that we need to look at and advocate for changing. There are very suitable people out there who would very willingly serve on boards if that was not a requirement. And the second thing with regards to the training, which I totally agree with Dr. Farrell, could we not incorporate board director training, governance training as part of our MBA programs? Almost a module. So Lockjack and UE and these other places where we have adult learners as opposed to children, often a range of ages. And this then could become an elective as part of your MBA, for example, and one could interact with experienced directors as well as the Governance Institute. But I think if you infuse it into some of the more formal leadership training that's offered here, that's a great way of just accessing a wide range of potential directors. Thank you.
But I can tell you, Lara, that in fact, the MBA programs does now include a module on corporate governance. Both Faye and I lecture in that program at the Lockjack Global School. I have been lecturing in it for the Australian Institute of Business, as well as there's a component of it in the University of Bedfordshire's MBA, which is offered in Trinidad and Tobago at the moment. So I think universities around the world have recognized the importance of ensuring that our MBA students understand what is governance and understand that relationship between them as senior managers and what happens in the boardroom. I'm also happy to share that we have a few of our MBA students from the Lockjack Global School of Business who had expressed interest and who are present with us today to learn, and be a part of Governance Week with us. So I'm happy to welcome them and to have heard from Lara share as well that, this is something that we need to do as part of our formal education. And certainly, I know the board of CCGI, would support me in us looking to see how we can expand that reach so we get more and more young people being able to be exposed and understand. I wanted to also share that there is an example, apart from Jamaica, where they have a system for creating a database of persons who are trained in corporate governance, from which persons ought to be selected for appointment to state enterprises. In Curacao, some of you may recall the contribution from Donald De Palm at last year's Governance Week, where he spoke to they having a code for state-owned enterprises and some of the processes and procedures which must follow. Included in that is the fact that any person who is appointed to a board must come with some measure of governance training, or if not, you have 6 months in which you need to ensure that you engage in formal training so that you are better prepared for functioning in the boardroom. And I don't see any difficulty with us being able to extend that type of practice to what we see happening here in the other countries in the region. So there is also a comment from Eric Griffith. And Eric, I'm not sure if you are a user, because of course we are seeing your name here. So unless you're using 2 devices, but I am going to read out your comment, which is to say, just to clarify, I do not believe that we are at the point of maturity where anyone can be appointed regardless of their political affiliation and be expected to carry out the government mandate. I am sorry, I don't agree with that. I do believe that we have persons who can be appointed and who will carry out a mandate effectively for improvement of organizations in the state sector. But what happens is what Dr. Farrell spoke to, and that is the level of political interference which happens, which then prevents you from being able to feel that you are contributing in a significant way. So the point of maturity that we need to reach at is one that is a lot more all-embracing. And Dr. Farrell, I want to take issue with this point that you raised, and that was who really are the owners of companies and by extension state enterprises. As you said in your presentation, governments would strongly resist being told that they are not the owners of state enterprises. But I want to share very strongly that they are not And we need to help them understand that they're not, that it is in fact the citizens of the country, and that citizens in fact support not one political party, but several, and that there are citizens who may support a political party which goes in office, but does not mean that they support the actions that they may take, especially when it comes to some of those decisions that are more self-interest and for political gain rather than for development of the country. So your thoughts on that?
Well, the government is the owner. I mean, the government is the owner. I mean, I don't want to give a lecture on political science here, but when a government is elected, it is elected to run the affairs of the country. That's what it is elected to do.
Yes.
And there's a parliamentary opposition which can scrutinize and which can debate and so on, but the government is there and it is in charge, and until another election, it is in charge. And it doesn't represent the constituents who voted for it. It represents every single citizen. And that's what Parliament is there for. Parliament is there to hold the government accountable on behalf of the citizenry. So we can say things like, well, the enterprise is owned by citizens. I mean, that, quite frankly, that statement is true, but from a practical point of view, it is meaningless. It's like saying that ExxonMobil is owned by the hundreds of thousands of shareholders. The hundreds of thousands of shareholders don't run ExxonMobil. Is run by the directors, who are 15 or 16 people who are there in fact, and in practice. That is what happens. In the same way, a state enterprise, the government of the day may decide we want to have an airline or we want to have a shipping company. We are going to put the money into that, we're going to invest in it, and they are perfectly entitled to do that. They can take the issue to Parliament, they could debate it, they can take the mandate of the enterprise to Parliament, it can be debated there, but it is the government's duty, its responsibility, and its right to be able to do that. Because otherwise, what would then happen? The government would be paralyzed. The government can't go and ask 1.3 million people every Monday morning what to do, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm afraid I don't agree. The government is the owner acting on behalf of the citizens and has the responsibility and the right, while it is in office, to be able to direct and do certain things. The point that we are making is simply this. If I have an airline, if I have a bank, if I have a government-owned insurance company, if I have a government-owned flour mills, right? That is right. Then I have to be clear about why I have it.
Exactly.
Because you see, if for example, flour mills, why do I have to own the entity? If I wanted to regulate the price of rice and the price of flour, I could regulate the price of rice and the price of flour if I wanted to do that. So I don't need to have a state enterprise. But if I do have a state enterprise and I'm clear about what it is I wanted to do, I give it its mandate. I'm saying, adopt the New Zealand model. Let us take the mandate to Parliament. Be clear, we discuss it, we debate it. I'm going to win anyway because I have a majority in Parliament. I take it so the citizens have an opportunity to debate, and then I let the board get on with it. And I'm clear with them. If it is failing, then I have a right as the government to step in and say, you're failing, you're losing money, and this is taxpayers' money, and therefore we are going to have to put a stop to this, or you need to do something different. In the case of an airline, for example, our recommendation on BWI was not that you're running the airline to make money. The objective of running CAL was for CAL to break even, not to make money, because the reason why you had CAL was that you wanted to keep the other foreign airlines honest in terms of providing airlift into Trinidad and Tobago. It's a different market from Barbados or Jamaica. The airlines will fly into Barbados or Jamaica anyway because of the tourist traffic, because of the demand for flights, but not so Trinidad. And so therefore, for strategic reasons, you said, let us have an airline that is going to keep American Airlines and JetBlue and all the rest of them honest in terms of operating in this market. And you can, if you can do that and you can break even, great. That's all I want from you. I subsidize separately. You just break even, and that's what you want to do. But if you didn't have BW, if you we debated as a task force. Let me just say to you very quickly, we debated as a task force closing down BWI entirely, and we said that was an option. But the problem with that option, as the problem with Carl now, people talking about Carl losing money and so on, Carl, right? that the problem with that option is that if you did not have an airline, you then leave yourself at the mercy of the JetBlues, the Uniteds, and the American airlines flying into this market.
So let me add to that, because I think Terry went the right way, because what we have been talking about this so far in this week is the fact that the directors are focused on the company, not the shareholders. It's focused on what is best for the company. And therefore, the critical question is, what is the mandate? What is the company's purpose? And once you are acting consistent with that purpose, you should be okay. It's not the ownership, it's the purpose. So for me, if one is satisfied that the company has been set up with the right mandate and with the right purpose, then your job is to execute that purpose and to resist any interference, well, as diplomatically as possible when it happens. But that's the job, to deliver on the purpose.
Okay, so it's 12:33. I did anticipate that, you know, the discussion would have been very involved, and that we will be pressed to try and finish on time. So we do have two, a question and a comment in the chat. I'm going to read it out loud, but we're not going to be able to address it because, you know, a lot of it was discussed. So the last one from Kendra Thomas, where she asks, how can we advocate for rollout of legislation regulating state-owned enterprises in the local context, similar to Norwegian and New Zealand model? What special considerations will have to be taken into account to enable an effective rollout there? So to begin with, there needs to be political will and a lot of courage, but I will invite Dr. Farrell to come back some other time in the future, because I think it's important. Go ahead, Dr. Farrell.
No, I can just say very quickly, that is recommendation number 4 in our report.
Okay, so what I will commit to do is to share that report with persons who are present today, so you have an opportunity to read, review, and then come back to us at CCGI and say if we need to discuss recommendation 1, 2, 3, 4, and whichever ones to talk about execution at this point. So I want to end with the comment from Lara, because you know, we have to live with the reality of what's happening with our state enterprises. So she says, a state enterprise presents no audited financials for years. They appear before the Joint Select Committee and still no consequence. No one gets fired or held accountable. That is our problem. People know there are no consequences for non-compliance, and non-compliance is always the easiest path. We have a lot of work to do. So I want to thank Dr. Farrell for this really, really engaging presentation this morning that has opened up our minds to so many possibilities, you know, if we want to be a part of, and I appreciate, Lara, that, you know, there are persons like yourself who wish to be a part of that solution. I in fact had a short conversation with Mariano Brown asking that there be, you know, a sort of collaboration between CCGI and the Lockjack Global School. We need to help take the lead in trying to bring about some of these solutions. that are plaguing us. So we are happy to have persons like yourself volunteer, because there's really a lot to be done. And we are happy that Dr. Farrell is already very integrally part of all that we do moving forward. So we bring an end to this morning's session now. I thank you all for attending. Our first panel for today begins at 1 p.m. And that's going to be former Attorney General John Jeremy and retired Permanent Secretary Aline Makomi. And we are going to have Angela Leloy as our moderator. Please, you need to join the link that is sent for that session. Immediately as you come out of this room, you can click on the next link. Christy will have the room open for us, so ensure you are settled, and then you can take a short break and join us again as we begin with our first panel for today, day 3 of Governance Week 2021. Thank you all.